Hello everybody, Nate with Cam Power Sports here. We're going to get started on part 4. We're just going to look at the transmission a little bit today. And I'm not going to go through every little step, but I'll touch basis on it. We already discussed a couple of the wear points to check in previous videos. Make sure and go back and check those out if you haven't seen them. That way we can keep this short. I laid the transmission out like this to just kind of portray what's going on here. Each of your shift forks is following the eccentric groove in the shift drum, and we'll slide the pinions back and forth to engage with the dogs, and we'll point those out a little bit better when we break them down. We discussed the flat spots of the wear here, so in the corresponding grooves you want to check the cam areas and look around the grooves and make sure. This one has a pretty good step right here. You want to make sure that those aren't too bad. When this gets a flat and this gets a flat combined, you lose travel at the pinion, and then you begin only partially engaging. So there comes a point where a lot of your misshifts could be because you're not pushing this pinion over far enough to engage it completely in its home. And once it gets so extreme, it'll quit catching, and you'll start to jump out of gear, you'll start to miss shifts, things like that. So without carrying on too much, this is where your sprocket goes. You're gonna look at that area. This one has a little bit of indication on it. Long story short, if the nut's a little bit loose, which we see quite a bit, the sprocket can rock a little bit extra, and you'll begin to show steps on the spline. So you'll want to look at that, ensure the health of your output shaft. One other thing that happens frequently, or that we see quite a bit anyway, is when that kick idle gear loses a washer or the bushing gets bad enough to rock consistently, this groove right here that holds the snap ring for that assembly on the clutch side will begin to chip away, and there becomes a point where it won't even hold a snap ring, a brand new snap ring. So you want to look at the end of that shaft, make sure that you're not chipped away. Just the D flat is the only thing that's missing from the snap ring groove. Another thing is I have seen where these shafts will get bowed, and so you want to check them for straightness. We've diagnosed some hard shifting problems that came down to a bowed shaft and the gears pulled tight on one side. I'm not going to go through every little thing. You're just looking for the key wear details in most cases. Purpose-built items get different attention, so overrides, pro mods. When I break this down, I'll kind of explain what goes into each and try to help clarify. We see that question on social media quite a bit, what the difference is and what one will do for you. Again, when you get into the modifying world, as I've stated in previous videos, there's a lot of different ways to go about doing something, and there's a lot of different tiers, and depending on how you're riding your bike, depends on what some of these modifications best suit your needs. And sometimes a great sounding modification may not be the best route to go because it's not what you're doing with your particular bike as far as riding style and maintenance schedules. Some things do require more maintenance and teardowns, while other things can give you longer intervals between having to turn bolts. So it just depends on what you're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show kind of some circlips, the theory behind them, but I'm not going to video taking every single one off. Pretty much tools needed. These transmissions, we've all gotten by with using a pair of screwdrivers to work with circlips and retaining clips. On these particular transmissions, they're kind of thin, they're delicate. OEM service manuals recommend not reusing any of these service clips. They always be changed. It goes both ways on that one. We use new components for engines that we're doing. But for myself, I am definitely guilty of reusing the circlips. The key is to not spring them, bend them, force them, pry them, open them as a little as possible to get them to disengage from the groove and slide off the spline. Your snap ring pliers need to be a quality pair. At least the tips need to be good and shouldered. have a good square shoulder, excuse me, and they need to be able to get a good bite, because these the snap rings inside the assembly that locates each individual gear, they're relatively thin with a good spring to them, so you need snap rings that gets a good bite on them, you know, so you can get them off smoothly and successfully without springing them or bending them. In any case, I'll set this aside, we'll move on, and we'll lay out the shafts how I lay them out on the bench so that you can remember order, little things that help, and we'll move forward with busting down the countershaft. We'll be right back. Okay, we're going to be working with the countershaft first, and I lay everything out in order how it came off. It keeps things from getting confusing, it gives you a good reference. If you're using like a parts microfiche from the internet as kind of a diagram, which can be helpful, your layout will kind of match how those microfiche pictures are taken from, and most of those hail from the OEM books in the first place. So in any case, your layout's going to somewhat match how the microfiches are. It helps keep confusion down. These are not that complicated. Order is important, as well as a lot of things are directional. We'll get into that. So the bearings here, they're just a slip fit. Sometimes they can be a little stuck from history, but they just slide off. I'll just lay them like that. We'll see if that fits the screen. Okay, so it all unloads from one end, and I'll show the first circlip and we'll kind of go from there. So stand it up on end. This circlip has been reused. I can see it's angled, but in any case, get in there. Yep, the circlip's been bent. Release your circlip, again with the least amount of spring tension, nice and square, good bite with the snap ring pliers. There's your first thrust washer to protect the gear against the circlip and also protect the circlip from the gear catching it and releasing it. This is one of the ones that showed a lot of wear on it. You can feel it in the step and in the hourglass in the main shaft. It does not slide off smoothly, so there's a burr. You're going to inspect both your wear surfaces. This one's a bushing. It doesn't have deep lines grooved into it, so that part of it looks great. There is a nice burnish mark on the shaft. I can't feel anything. We will measure those and check the fit. Chances are the looseness has been wear portrayed in the bushing, and we'll address those. You're going to look at the corners of your spokes and make sure that the corners aren't beveled down. Sorry. Okay, you're going to look at the corners of your spokes and make sure that they're not rounded off. That you're going to check the hardening. Basically, the mating corner of the dog that's on the pinion. You're going to check the mating corner of the dog to the spoke. That way, if they're rounded off, that allows them to bounce off and come around. See this? I don't know if the light shows it in the camera. You can see the highlight on this face of where the face of the dog slides across. So it has to roll across and then be able to index in and drop in to get a good contact and lock to that gear and engage that gear. If that corner and that corner is too rounded, you'll see more instances than less of where that dog will pass and go one more, and oftentimes in the amount your foot travels, that's a misshift, and that's your false neutral. So those are two key areas to look at on each gear. These pinions should slide smooth on the shaft with not too excessive play in the rotational direction. A little bit's acceptable. And you can check your splines by putting a bit of clockwise and counterclockwise tension on the pinion and putting them against the side of the spline, and then feel its travel and make sure that there's no burrs, flat spots, or hang-ups. oftentimes those can be addressed, and you don't necessarily need to buy new components to address that. Your next layer is another one of the thin snap rings I was describing. This one, actually, I can see a small crack in the hole, but they have a good spring to them, and your snap ring pliers need to be fit and square. And same story as you go through the process, the exact same thing. The back side of your pinion has your dogs for this gear, this one has a little bit of rounding on the corners, and it will get addressed. And the spokes on this one, they're moderate. For what we're doing, I'm probably gonna opt to change this gear. I don't know if that's some heat or stain. Looks more like stain, a little bit of contamination. So one gear at a time, lay it out in order as it comes apart, and you know, just inspect all of your mating components. Again, these snap rings are fairly springy for their thickness, so they can be frustrating, and they're a good fit. Another thing I want to mention, and we'll point at it later when we get apart, these snap rings actually are directional. They have a stamped side that's nice and square on all their profiles, and the other side is slightly rounded. The rounded side always goes towards the rotating component, and that's mostly for oiling purposes. Your pinion, your snap ring is not stopping your pinion. It hits the gear long before the snap ring. So in this particular snap ring right here, the rounded side of the snap ring would face away from your pinion and towards the rotating component. That's your rule of thumb through the entire transmission on direction. Okay, we'll pause the camera for a minute and break this thing down and lay it out. So we've kind of, for the sake of fitting it on the camera screen and not being too far away and having to zoom, we've kind of laid it out in two rows. So we start with the little bearing at this end, and we go in order, and then we pick up at this end again and go through each individual one. This bearing I put here just to help, you know, kind of establish order. Wouldn't quite fit off camera where it belongs at the end of this row. Okay, so on the countershaft itself, the areas, and I kind of hope light reflection shows it, so I'll just rock it a little bit as I talk. The areas that get wear is, of course, where that pinion was between each of the gears, this pinion and this sliding pinion. They get a little bit of wear in the hardening, as well as a little step develops at the C-clip groove. So oftentimes this shaft at a minimum needs some polishing work. Again, you're going to be looking at your splines, the condition of your splines along where the pinions slide. You could feel that with the pinion, like I stated previously, and your surfaces. You can clearly see something was going on with first gear versus everywhere else that a gear bushing rides. So it's going to need some, at a minimum, polishing, but it needs to be measured accurately and checked. Make sure it's spec. It's best to check the shaft for run out, you know, checking it for bent with dial indicators in the centers, in several places that you can get a dial indicator, and check the shaft for any run out. We have seen them bent, and so that's something that you should consider doing. I know not everybody has tooling to do that. You've gone this far, I would check it for run out. This thrust washer is an indicator of one that's probably fine, but is going to get changed. The blackening is its coating, and it's also, you know, serves a little bit of, offers a little bit of lubrication property over and above the oil. It's all but worn off on this, so it's a good indicator, regardless of its condition, that, you know, this, and assuming the rest of the thrusting components, like these other thrust washers that go with the snap rings, all of them combined will add up to, you know, possibly some substantial wear. These are the snap rings. that are recommended to be, by the manufacturer to be changed. If you're going to try and reuse stuff, and I get that, and some things you don't just need to change because you're there, I get that. The manufacturer, again, recommends that it not be reused ever. If you're the type that makes judgment calls and likes to reuse stuff, the one that sees the most wear is the one that sandwiches the two gears in the center and separates the two gears in the center. That one can get pretty good grooves worn in the gears, so you need to look there extra hard on these two gears. I mean, you're supposed to check all of them, but because this one is sandwiched, and this one's a judgment call too, because I talked about one side of it having the stamped nice sharp corner and the other side of it having a slight radius to the corner. Which way does it face? So all the other ones that include this thrust washer and the snap ring and are facing the pinion, the sliding pinion, that's self-explanatory. But again, this one goes between those two gears in the assembly and creates their separation, so those gears are always rotating against that snap ring. So put your focus there. I'm not going to substantiate that you should reuse these. The manufacturer says replace them for a reason. I choose my own risk in the shop here on my own personal stuff, but everything else, they get changed. The input shaft is the exact same procedure, and you know, and you're going to lay it out just the same way. So as you can see, you need a little bit of bench space for these and some clean rags and an area that, if you're going to come back next week, an area that can be left alone for a week and not get scattered, nice and safe, not balanced. We've all had that open toolbox on the edge of the bench, right? Okay, as far as Pro Mod versus Override, you get that question a lot, and those are the nicknames for two of the modifications. The Pro Mod is, for the best sake of comparison, is a lot like updating this older transmission design to newer standards. If you look at these gears, if you look at the gears, the driven gears, they have these 6 spokes in there with the pockets that the pinion is going to reach. The pinion is the sliding gear, and these nubs on the pinions are called dogs. The dogs mate with the spokes to lock it in gear. So as it travels over, they mate, and that is the driving force, whichever way it's rotating. That is the driving force. When they're not mated, that gear is allowed to coast free on the shaft, and for a lack of better explanation, that's your neutral for that gear. Dog engages it, and you're driving the bike. So on a Pro Mod, and many new bikes built today, like the YFC 450, you know, most of them, a lot of them, have 3 spokes and 3 dogs. The Pro Mod first step is to bust down the transmission and rejuvenate all of the wear items, the normal wear items that are in the transmission after inspection of the other wear points. When you do a Pro Mod, or when a Pro Mod is done, and the best way is to utilize someone's machining services, you can grind these dogs out. I'm sorry, the spokes. You can grind the spokes out, but you got to watch your heat. The hardening is thin on these gears, and the interior metal, for all intents and purposes, is quite a bit softer than the hardened surface. You kind of want to watch your heat. You don't want to affect the hardening. You want to cut cool and clean, but long story short, you are removing every other spoke so that you are back to just the 3 spokes. What that does for you is it allows more time for the pinion to get slid over by the shift fork and engage. A little bit more time allows it to get home instead of a dog bouncing off the spoke and that being one of those infamous misshifts or false neutrals. So there is a service called back cutting, and that deals with the angles, and 90% of the guys out there cutting pro mods do not deal with that. More specialty transmission guys that have dedicated setups to get those angles correct. That's a good feature to go ahead and back cut, as the nickname goes, the spoke and dog relationship. It just creates a more positive engagement. I won't go too deep into that. It's definitely something worth exploring for a quality job. And when you're sending your transmission to somebody to get machined, that's a question that you can ask about and a feature that you can decide if it fits your personal needs. So the Pro Mod pretty much essentially works exactly like a stock transmission, and your first step, of course, was to remove every other spoke to generate the extra time to get a positive engagement with the dog to attain the gear quickly and positively. The other couple supporting mods in the Pro Mod that you see quite a bit requires a little bit of modification to the shift shaft. They slot. In the previous video we showed that that cammed eccentric adjusting screw on the shifter. Where that screw lines up with the window in the shift shaft, that gets slotted a little bit to ensure a little extra travel out of your shifter so that you can positively get that next gear, and it'll keep the shift shaft. It also helps it being stopped early. I'll walk over and grab one and point real quick so you can understand what I'm talking about. So on your shifter shaft, the eccentric screw, the adjusting screw, rides between those two springs. When you shift this, it's rocking against that screw, loading the spring to return. So when you go to a gear or downshift, it's rotating as such. So if you just grind a relief here and a little bit here, then that allows just a little bit more positive travel before this wall can potentially hit that eccentric screw when you actually shift it and open that spring up. I'm going to unload the spring. So you're on your eccentric screw and it rolls, and it can stop at that eccentric screw. If things are out of adjustment a little bit, it's a tight window, it just helps to relieve this corner a little bit. I've seen them where they've been cut way out. That's pointless. It's mostly to address a little bit of flex, case wear, and things like that. They work great with plenty of clearance in stock form when everything is brand new and fresh, but it's not a perfect world. So that does help with the Pro Mod in the action of this. The other thing I didn't point out when we busted down the clutch side was the health of these claws and the tightness of that rivet. If this gets too sloppy, you're going to have a lot of travel in your shifter mechanism soaked up before the claw can engage on the accompanying post on the shift star and activate the shift. So you want to check the health of this rivet and the spring tension here, this spring, and look for bends and damage in that spring as well. This component right here is the #1 cause of poor shifting bikes over everything else I've mentioned. This wear point right here has to be in good order, or else it can't. You're only working with a little bit of play. So in order for those claws to do what they need to in the amount of travel that you have out of your foot, that union with that rivet needs to be in good order, and that's huge. So okay, enough on that. That's attention that's given to it at the Pro Mod. Some guys do other things, but essentially that's what it takes in here to compensate for worn cases, history on the engines, things like that. and make sure that you can get a positive rotation on the shift drum so that pinion can essentially engage that dog cleanly and all the way. So that's the bulk of what you're going to be looking for on a teardown. That is the start of the Pro Mod. The other service, and we do it override and Pro Mod alike, is this other half of this shift drum rides in the case. There's no bushing, it's just on the aluminum. Granted, it's just a click at a time, but it still rides on the case. Sometimes they can get a little bit galled. Sometimes because of the way that neutral cover door is that we showed you in one of the previous videos, a lot of dirt and crud can build up here and it can actually begin to grind. So one thing that we do, and a lot of other supporting mods do, is cut this end down in the lathe and install a bearing that fits the case on a slip fit. There's many different methods of doing this. I've seen guys use needle bearings. I've seen guys modify the cases for different bearings. All of them are probably fine, I guess, because you know you're just dealing with little partial turns at a time each click. But getting a bearing on this end to support it is it just definitely helps support that fluid shift, and that's what you're after. Why a Pro Mod over an override? We'll just touch slight basis on an override real quick. I've talked a lot about the Pro Mod. An override, if you're going, you've heard terms and seen terms like neutral down and 2 through 5 or 1 through 4 or whatever. In an override, you're modifying quite a few more things to make this even more purpose-built. Now, in order to get neutral down, short of just taking first gear off and starting with second and having first gear's position be the new neutral and having actually 2 neutral spots, you can do it that way. You can remove your first gear and just run your 2 through 5, 2 through 6, whatever, 2 through 6. You would have a neutral down because there is no more first gear anymore, and first gear is all the way down with your foot lever, correct? But the proper way is to reprogram this shift drum for what you're doing. That requires welding of these eccentrics, grinding them, reprogramming this shift drum, and changing how it moves the forks so that you can get the result you want. The proper neutral down locates and moves neutral to the other side of first gear in the eccentric path that the first gear fork is going to follow. That's quite a process. We're not going to get into that, but that's how that is done. Whatever you're doing with your override configuration, there's quite a few floating out there. It requires welding and machining of this shift drum and or fabrication of a drum, you know, from scratch, from bar. So you got to reprogram the drum to get a neutral down and things like that. And there's other modifications that we're not going to get into in creating the different overrides, like your 2 through 5 or your 1 through 4. We've seen many different variations. There's a lot of different things, and there's a few different ways of going about that, and some things that are pretty trick that have to happen. We're not going to get into those details, and that's you know, I could make 10 videos on all of that alone. So that's what goes on with the shift drum. Pro Mod, it pretty much, despite a little bit of blueprinting, possibly polishing, if you know you want to get into that. I don't, because you're polishing away hardening, but Pro Mod, this pretty much is run as stock. It gets an upgrade here with the bearing. Also check this needle bearing that comes, make sure it's in good order. And the override, when you start going neutral down and stuff, that requires modifications to this shift drum to reprogram at what point and when the shift forks are being moved with the pinions to attain what you're after. So the other part of the override is timing. The Pro Mod already enabled more time, and the first step of an override is to do a Pro Mod. You're still going to cut out every other spoke for that timing. The next step to get it to shift under full power is you need to be able to establish an overlap on the two gears so that it's a smooth transition. I don't know the best way to explain the dynamics on that, but long story short, what leads you in that direction for the transmission to work like that is to take the dog at a given point and it's figured out and 45 off the non-driving wall. So the driving wall is still square, but then you're cutting ramp out of the rest of the dog. And for that reason, the biggest thing, that part of an override that gets done, now when you're driving your transmission, when you're driving your transmission, your drive dog and spoke are square, and they load up and they bind, and that becomes your drive. When you do an override mod, you need to be able to push this gear out of gear as the next gear is coming into gear. So in order to do that, when it shifts, the two ratios creates play between the main shaft, and because it's ramped, it puts the positive disengagement of that gear in action. That works beautifully. The problem with that is, and the confusion where there is, and we're going to jump into one of my opinion things for a split second, because of that, when the tires push the bike, as you read or hear all over the place, when you backload this transmission and you allow the tires to push the bike or the bike to drive the engine, however you want to look at it, you are going up against those 45s with the full weight of the bike, but the shift fork, the drum hasn't rotated. The shift fork's never been allowed. It never moved over to allow the disengagement. So when you allow the bike to drive the gear in an override, it tries to push it apart. Physics is physics. You've cut a ramp on it now. It tries to push it apart. If the shift fork has not moved, it puts an extreme amount of pressure on the shift forks against that riding surface. Depending on what gear you're in, against the riding surface for the gear that you're in. It's trying to push it out. The shift drum hasn't turned. You're putting extreme pressures on that shift fork. Even if it doesn't fail, you're going to experience a very short shift fork life and ruined pinions if you backload and override a lot. You hear terms out there and read about terms out there called a tunable override. They add some springs and try to give some cell ploys that it works like an override, yet you can ride it and backload it. I've never seen something that's true to that. I have never seen it. Physics is physics. When you cut that ramp and then try and drive that pinion with the gear or backload or let the bike push the engine, however you want to word it, physics is physics. It doesn't matter if there's springs to help it stay engaged installed on the transmission or not. It's still going to try and push it apart, and the shift drum hasn't turned. So in my opinion, there's no such thing as a tunable override. At your risk, whether one wears faster than another, you're going to change shift forks if you do an override. That's the bottom line. If you're okay with that, you can do an override all day long, and it's quite fun. We ride ours out on the dunes. We know we have to do shift forks. We pay attention. We try to minimize our backload. We try to pull the clutch every time. Things happen. Terrain backloads it. Uneven terrain can backload your transmission to a degree. There's no such thing as a tunable override. An override allows you to shift under wide open throttle, full power, very smoothly, very quickly, no clutch, no blipping the throttle. You just grab the gear. And if everything's in sync and everything's done quality, it is a very, very nice thing. The Pro Mod allows you to ride your bike how it was intended, but quite a bit more smooth with reduced misshifts and with less problems with your shifting that are inherent with the Banshee. So it just depends on how you're riding. If you're trail riding, duning, backloading, downshifting to hold yourself back on hills, any of that nature, chances are an override is not for you, even though they have some very nice shifting features. If you're okay with pulling your engine and busting it down all the time for shift forks, you know, then that's fine. That's why the differences, that's what's going on in there. It is a judgment call. If you're doing 50-50 riding where you do some drag racing but you also play with your bike, you just have to decide how often you want to do your maintenance versus, you know, the features that you want in your riding. So that's the bulk of the transmission. That's kind of a summary without getting too deep into everything on what's going on here. The difference between a Pro Mod and an override, and hopefully that kind of clears some air. You'll read guys say I've had tunable overrides in there for years. You know, you can't argue the physics there. So if they had it in there for years, that's great. How many hours per year do they actually ride? There's so many variables on things that's going on. It just comes down to what you want to do for maintenance. It's going to happen. Some setups faster than others. People modify things different ways, but it's going to happen. So how often do you want to change shift forks? Overrides are sure nice. Even a 1 to 6 with the neutral in the same location, overrides are nice, but you will see more wear and tear using them outside of, you know, a straight drag world where you pin it, run your gears, pull the clutch, and shut the bike down. Those overrides, of course, will last a lot longer if you can remember good clutch behaviors and not letting the engine, the tires drive the engine, you know, the bike drive the transmission. So it's a must to pull the clutch every time with an override. That is about the bulk of what's going to be looked at in the transmission. We'll kind of show the components. This one's going to become an override. All these snap rings are going to get changed. All these thrusters are going to get changed. There's a couple gears I see a little extra rounding on, and we'll address those. So long story short, that's the difference between the two. A lot of the other mods, the bearing on the shift drum, the notching of the shift shaft, and the mods that are done there, they're interchangeable. Override, Pro Mod, they both get a lot of those supporting mods, and you know, in a lot of cases should have some of those supporting mods. But that's the key difference between the override is your shift dog right here. If you buy a transmission used and you look down between it even without disassembling it, and that dog has been 45'd off, regardless if it's a quality job or not, regardless if it's a complete transmission or not, with the matching programming of the shift drum, you at least know that that's an override style cut modification, and you probably shouldn't install it if you're going to be doing riding that introduces a lot of backloading to the transmission. And if you do install it, just be well aware the shift forks are still available, and you're going to be buying a few of them and doing that as maintenance. We hope this part of the video helped. I don't know if I'll stretch the next parts into the same video, but at this point the countershaft is addressed the exact same way. I'll lay them all out, but when you're doing this, perhaps you know, one transmission at a time so it isn't confusing. And they're not super complicated, but these orders are important. If you goof on these orders in any way, either the transmission won't work when you install it, and that'll be frustrating and you'll have to resplit the cases, or if you're out of order with something, it may still work, but you're going to have some you're going to have quite a bit of premature failures, whether it's burning up and then having play in the gear, and causing further damages because the orders are wrong. So just be clean and lay out your orders however it makes sense to you. But this works well. Lay it out in the order you took it apart. Do it in an area it can be left alone for a minute. If you need to move it and put it back, you can take a shot of this with your camera and then slide all the components minus the snap rings into where they go, but at least you have your shot with your camera, as well as your parts microfiches on the internet. The original parts microfiche picture usually does an okay job of depicting the order as you're looking through those components, so that can be helpful. If you're laid out similar to that parts picture, it's gonna be less confusing, and then you can pay attention to details like which side is the rotating side and which way to face the radius part of the circlip too. So we will be back. I don't know if we'll make another video for the assembly side. I doubt we're going to video assembling it. It's a reverse procedure. These snap rings, you just want to flex as little as possible to get them into their homes. And you want to, especially if they're brand new, you want to minimize how many times. So keep your orders straight. Look through it first. Make sure it makes sense first. Then install it back together how it should be. So just take a little time. Keep things clean. Keep it organized. Pay attention to the little details of the thrust washers, where they go, the beveled side, the rounded side of the snap ring, which way it would face on the assembly, and you'll successfully be able to service your transmission. Plus, even if you're going to send your transmission out, hopefully this video helped put some enlightenment on it so that you can ask the proper questions to purchase what you need for what you're doing, and so that what you're purchasing in a service makes sense to you. We'll be back with more videos. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and like and comment on anything you see. And again, I just want to reiterate, when I do share my opinion and it comes to the modification world, there are definitely different ways to go about it, and different things suit different needs. So I'm not conveying the absolute correct or incorrect way to do stuff. It's just as simple as it's the way that I do things sometimes, and it's not the only way. So I appreciate you watching, and we'll be back.